Okay, this is Angel Miller, author of The Three Stages of Initiatic Spirituality and The Path of the Warrior Mystic. And I haven't done any interviews for quite some time, but it's something I'm hoping to get back to a little more regularly. The interview you're going to hear tonight is with Greg Kaminsky. He is the publisher of the excellent Cult of Personality podcast, and he's also the author of Proneos, Reflections on the Preliminary Practices of Buddhist Tantra and Celestial Intelligences, which is on the life and work of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, which we're going to discuss tonight. And Mirandola was the figure who really introduced Kabbalah to the wider world of Western intellectual thought, into Christian theology, and of course from there, later on, Kabbalah entered into the world of sort of Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, the Occult, the New Age, and today, of course, it's a fairly well-known spiritual tradition, even among secular Westerners. Greg Kaminsky, thanks for joining us. So your new book is Celestial Intelligences, which is about the figure Pico della Mirandola, a Renaissance thinker who really introduced the Kabbalah to Western thought, I would say, outside of Judaism, that is. And of course, the Kabbalah in recent years has become very popular and has been popular within the world of Western esotericism for a long time, really even before the Golden Dawn during the 19th century. So perhaps you could just tell us maybe a little bit about you and a little bit of how you came into contact with the thought of Mirandola.
Sure. Thank you, Angels. Wonderful to speak with you. So my name, again, is Greg Kaminsky, the host and producer of the Occult of Personality podcast. And I had to write a thesis as part of my master's degree. And one of the topics that I've always been interested in was how the Jewish Kabbalah came to be basically the foundation for Western esotericism, because that really just never made any sense to me at all, and yet it was very interesting. So, and throughout my years at school, sort of preparing us for this thesis at the end, they were always saying, like, you know, in order to succeed at this thesis, you have to really be interested in this subject, because you're going to spend, you know, minimum 18 months doing nothing else. So you really better love it. So that really made me want to explore this question. And as I researched it to sort of write the proposal, before I could even begin the thesis itself, I was reading all about how the Christian philosophers came to learn about and become enamored with the Kabbalah. And that was where I stumbled into the figure of the Italian Renaissance philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And the reason is because he is the first. He's the first one to learn Hebrew and the Kabbalah from Jewish converts who fled the Spanish Inquisition and became his translators and tutors. And so Pico became famous because of a text called the Oration on the Dignity of Man. in which he publicly proclaimed that the Kabbalah was the only way to know that the Christian religion was true and valid. And so he was highly controversial, and the whole thing, Pico's, youthful exuberance and sort of over the top behavior, combined with, the mysticism of Judaism, combined with this sort of rebirth of Western esotericism in Renaissance Italy in the late 1400s. I mean, it's a heady mix, at least to someone like me.
Mm.
So that's how it all began, and the story is even more fascinating than what I've just laid out in the beginning here.
Mm. Yeah. So what do you think Pico's legacy is?
Well, I think his legacy is he has essentially, he jailbroke the Kabbalah out of Judaism and into whoever wants to explore it.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that was Pico's Kabbalah, because Pico's Kabbalah is highly specific and doesn't even match what most people listening to this think of as Kabbalah. So, right off the bat, there's definition issues, because the thing that I'm speaking about when I'm talking about Pico and then the way he learned the Kabbalah and the way he expressed it is highly mystical. It does not involve any sort of magical rituals or tables of correspondence or magical names or anything like that. It's really a system of contemplation and a way, a view of reality that allows one to transcend from, well, you could say here to there, it's from delusion to wisdom, but that journey is it's different for everyone.
Right, sure. Well, so how different was his Kabbalah to the Kabbalah of the day? Was it very different, or is it just different from what we've come to think of as Kabbalah?
Well, there really was no Kabbalah of the day.
Okay.
So that was, I think, the first thing to understand.
Yeah.
The Kabbalah at that time was only practiced by Jews.
Right.
And of a certain, particular persuasion.
Right.
And even that group was probably quite small.
Yeah.
So what Pico encountered primarily was sort of an understanding that the Kabbalah provided a way to know reality or truth, in as much as he talked about emulating angels and their behavior or activity in order to transcend the human mind, really. And so that involves, well, firstly involves learning and the coming to understanding of, what is philosophy and, ultimately what are we ourselves, as in know thyself. And then it involves understanding what is the divine. And from that understanding of what the divine is, then it's possible to act correctly in the world. So he's really prescribing like a spiritual path of mysticism that's kind of universal in a sense, if you break down spiritual paths in as much as like what they're actually doing and the way that they function. Like they'll have different methods and stages and steps, but what Pico's describing in this way is sort of like know thyself, know the divine, and then you'll be able to act properly. Like that's the template for basically any valid spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that he lays it out and discusses it, matches particularly well with like mystical Kabbalism in a Hasidic sense, particularly.
Right, yeah.
So it's interesting to just kind of understand that what he's articulating is both a truth that's kind of been veiled at that time for, probably many hundreds of years, at least publicly.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's also discussing something that's never not been true.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like those things are both valid simultaneously. So it's a little bit bizarre because people think of him as like a revolutionary, like sort of new philosopher, but like he's not actually saying anything new in any way at all. In fact, that would be kind of a violation of what he's actually saying.
Right.
So I don't know if with my digressions have answered your question there, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I think so. But there obviously is a big difference between the Kabbalah in, let's say, the occult world today, and as it was at that time or a little later on. So how do you see the Kabbalah developing through time or being used or maybe misused?
Well, Pico's really just talking about a way of conceptualizing
Right.
in order to go beyond concept.
Yeah.
And mostly when people are studying or talking about Kabbalah, it's really about using, particular names or understandings of correspondences or structures in order to gain insights or perform rituals or change one's consciousness or change one's circumstances or both. But Pico's really, his concern is just union with the divine and not really anything else beyond that.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond that, to him, there's nothing else but that. So that's kind of a weird concept. So, it's weird in the sense that there would be anything beyond that because there couldn't be anything beyond that. And yet, people do all of these other things. So, it's basically like the mystics would say, like, you can come fast or you can come slow, but in the end, you're going to come. But Pico, he was going to go fast. So that's why, he's talking about this idea of divine union, or we would say gnosis, or maybe even theosis, depending upon your level of faith.
Yeah. So how are you distinguishing the two, gnosis and theosis?
Well, gnosis is sort of to know.
Right.
And instead of being, knowing.
Right.
And theosis, I think, is more classically understood as sort of becoming God.
Right.
As in the Meister Eckhart sense.
Yeah.
You cannot know God, but you can be God.
Right.
And ultimately, yes, there are stages of realization, and there's ultimate realization.
Yeah.
And ultimate realization, I don't think these things are different, but what do I know?
So Pico was drawing really substantially from Kabbalistic texts, Jewish Kabbalistic texts, of course, but at the same time, he was using these texts to show the proof of Christianity as he saw it and understood it. although this wasn't really liked by the papacy of the day. So what was going on with that, taking Jewish Kabbalistic texts and then trying to use them to support his own Christian worldview?
Well, you have to also consider, who was teaching him this,
Yeah,
because these were converts to Christianity.
right.
These are former Jews who are now Christians. So, you could say, well, they were forced to convert. Well, maybe, but they still converted and they didn't convert back.
Right, yeah.
So they were teaching Pico secrets of Kabbalism that seemingly supported Christ's divinity.
Mm.
And, people can dispute that. You could say that's not valid, or that's a perversion of the tradition, or that's not real, but it's still there, and that's part of the Christian Kabbalistic tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the Christian Kabbalistic tradition says that, Judaism, predicts and validates the divinity of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective, it does. So, and I don't think this is really in any way different from the whole notion that Christianity itself is an extension of Judaism, like it's an unfolding revelation of God.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see how these are different ideas. To me, they're inextricably intertwined.
For sure.
So that's sort of the idea behind Pico and his Christian Kabbalah. He wasn't making something up.
Right.
I think there's some maybe misunderstanding, like that he somehow was ginning this up out of thin air, but that's not what was going on here. It's just that he saw everything through this sort of Christianized lens, and so Christ is divine, and religion and the way it unfolds over time is a product of that. It's not, somehow independent of it. It's all connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed.
Now, I'm not saying, Pico's ideas are rational necessarily, because on a certain, materialistic, nihilistic perspective of modern man, it's not. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I get that.
Right. But he himself seemed to believe that his thinking was rational, right?
Well, I mean, according to his perspective, it was.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, like, and this is an issue. I don't know if it's just an issue now or it's always been an issue, but, most people, there's people who can accept, like, I have an opinion, you have an opinion, we have different perspectives, so we arrive at different conclusions, and that's of course, how could it be any different?
Right, yeah.
And then you have people who are like, no, this is right, and that's wrong. Yeah. And so what I believe is right, and what you believe is wrong, and that's just it, and that's the end of it. And so you can reason with someone who understands it from the way of opinions and perspectives, but you cannot reason or even discuss it with someone who views it as right and wrong. And so the people who view it as right and wrong, like, don't even bother with them. Seriously, it's not worth their time. Unfortunately. And that's most of the world.
Right, of course.
So I think, when we're talking about Pico, and we're talking about people who can appreciate what he's saying, even though they might not agree with it, or they might not think it's fully logical or whatever. Like, yes, according to the way he saw it, according to what he understood, it made sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And so his method of transcendence was emulating angels, as I understand it from your book. So perhaps you could just go into that a little bit.
Sure. Well, there's a long tradition of angels in Christianity and in Judaism prior to that.
Mm.
So we understand angels as spiritual beings that are more close to the divine than we are. Whether, and that's physically and spiritually, if physically is such a real thing.
Right.
But so the idea is that humans have the capacity to put our minds on an idea, a place, a person. And if we focus our mind enough, like, not only do we, we're not just in a different place, we like become something else.
Right.
And that's the idea.
Yeah.
And this is not very different from the idea that each angel has a single function, right? And so like, they considered thoughts similar to angels. So if if your thought is so focused that it's single pointed, it's almost angelic. So the idea that one could enter into a contemplation so single pointed, and if that contemplation was on the divine itself, that one would not only be with the divine, one could, in a sense, understand their participation in divinity itself. And so the idea is that if we put our minds on what the angels put their mind on, and then do what they do, we can be like them. And then we can then be in a similar position spiritually. And so this would lead to union with the divine, and this would then also lead to a way of acting in the world that would be only of benefit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and so when he was talking about emulating angels, this doesn't seem to be anything resembling ritual magic. There's no sort of chanting of angelic names or using Hebrew or anything like that, from what I can tell. It seems to be more emulating them in terms of being charitable or praising God or being intelligent and so on. So perhaps you could just speak a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, the principal method here is contemplation itself.
Right.
So contemplation, for those who may not know or be aware, it's not really thinking about things, although it kind of begins in that way. Contemplation is actually, it starts as thought, but then it progresses into feeling states and subtle tones of flavors or impressions. And it's possible with practice to really actually lose oneself in the most literal sense when one engages in this practice.
Yeah.
So when Pico is talking about emulating the angels, so when he talks about like learning philosophy, like this involves this first involves the actual learning of the philosophy in a strict acquisition of knowledge. But then it also involves a contemplation on the implication and significance of that, which is an entirely spiritual method of reflecting upon the import of one's activity and how that affects, benefits, and imprints upon one in such a way that as you go beyond yourself, you're able to perceive exactly how it all fits together in a much more holistic way. And repeatedly doing this brings about a shift in perspective that you cannot even understand if you don't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this, I think, comes back to the sort of medieval ideas of ratio and intellectus. Ratio being the sort of rational thinking workhorse of the mind, and then intellectus being contemplation. You're kind of receiving something from the mind of God, as it were. If you look out onto a landscape and contemplate it, you're kind of peering into the mind of God and allowing it to kind of filter into you and mold you.
Yeah, I mean, really the idea would be to not think and to allow God to, be aware through you.
Right.
But it's once you get to that point, I think language does not actually work in terms of conveying whatever is going on or not going on.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, Pico was obviously an important thinker of the Renaissance period, but I think he's very obscure today. I mean, I think, I don't even really see him mentioned in the more intelligent histories of the occult or anything like that, considering how influential the Kabbalah in its sort of current form is on the occult. Did you have any thoughts about why that might be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's several reasons for this. Number one, Pico's whole thrust of what he was proposing was really not new. So what he was talking about was, although the way he presented it, it was highly intelligent, but it was so embedded within his philosophy that you would have to be initiated into it to really see and understand what he was doing and how brilliant it was. So I think that's part of it. Like, people don't actually know or see like what was so unique about his work. So that's part of it. Another part of it is his legacy was really obscured by his heirs because they wanted to cast him as a pious Christian and not some, wild Kabbalist who was, Judaizing and involved in heretical activities. And then there's the other part of it, which is that Pico's Kabbalah was, like we've been discussing, entirely mystical. It doesn't produce results which would necessarily better oneself in a conventional sense. Pico's spiritual path is a real, authentic spiritual path where that means like a path of giving up everything and getting nothing in return.
Right.
And when I say nothing in return, you could say getting no thing in return. But it's the same thing ultimately.
Sure. Yeah.
And so Pico's Kabbalah was generally discarded and disregarded in favor of the Kabbalah of like Agrippa or Christian Nor von Rosenroth and his translations. And I think Pico's Kabbalah is specific for spiritual practitioners who are just only concerned with union with the divine and nothing
Right.
else.
Right. So how does that differ from Agrippa's Kabbalah, for example?
Well, I think if you read Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and especially that third book, you can
Yeah.
see like the Kabbalah is I think designed for uh, one to be able to affect their
Mm-hmm.
consciousness, certainly, and
Yeah.
worldly circumstances.
Yeah.
None of which Pico advocated or discussed at all.
Yeah.
I mean, in his mind, the only point in engaging in natural magic was sort of as a way to learn about reality in order to become it.
Right. Yeah.
That was like, what else would you be doing? Like, what else is there?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I think he had just a radically different perspective. I mean, he had the perspective of a mystic who
Mm-hmm.
wants to know the divine. And
Mm.
that's different from someone who is interested in magic because they want to be more powerful or want to change, their circumstances or their identity into something,
Mm.
again, more powerful or perceived as, more attractive or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of curious, right? Because I mean, his views ultimately seem to be much more in line with Christianity, but he kind of fell afoul of the papacy, whereas I don't think Agrippa did to the same degree, although I could be wrong.
I'm not really clear on Agrippa's history,
Yeah,
so I wouldn't be able to comment on that. But Pico, certainly he was excommunicated,
right,
and his 900 theses were burned, and
right,
but I think he did have the intention of trying to inform the world that there is a tradition, many traditions, and a specific tradition that is available to people that they can, know the divine before they die.
right,
And that's completely possible, but it's not easy.
right, and the process is emulating the angels.
Right. And it's not easy because we're not easy and we're not like angels.
No,
So
we're not.
so
No.
emulating them makes us it's hard because, it's not the way we are normally.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so, would the practitioner have to sort of emulate one type of angel after another until he reaches the kind of most divine, or
Well, Pico talked about 3 specific orders of angels in his oration.
mm,
The cherubim,
yeah,
which he said you'd have to know thyself. So that involves learning philosophy, so you can know
right,
yourself and you can know what the world is.
yeah,
And then the seraphim, and this emulating the seraphim, one would know what the divine is
right,
and become truly devoted.
mm-hmm,
And then one could emulate the thrones, which means right action in the world. But one can't act correctly unless one is truly devoted to the divine, and one
yeah,
can't do that unless knows the divine, and one can't do that unless one knows the world and oneself. So
right,
there's a progression there, and so those are the main orders of angels that he really talked about emulating,
mm-hmm,
and the intentions and purposes that would be fulfilled by emulating them are in fact it isn't the accomplishment of specific stages of the spiritual path, no doubt about it.
mm,
But I think that there's a big difference between wanting to be a spiritual practitioner and like and having that identity, like thinking that is something interesting or
Mm-hmm.
worthwhile, and actually living it, which is
For
an
sure.
entirely different thing.
Yeah.
Entirely different thing. One seems fun
Yeah.
and pretty cool,
Yeah.
and the other is really often not fun, a lot of hard work, and
Mm.
yet yes, provides moments of joy and the realization of truth, but it's also like the amount of work and commitment involved is, I think, something most people, if they understood it, they would just run in the other direction.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So how has Pico influenced your spiritual path?
Well, I think there's been a lot of ways, but one in
Yeah.
particular that stands out is this sort of same realization I came to as I was actually writing this book,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
which is that one can know all the things, right? But that doesn't actually change you at
Mm.
all, because information is not transformation.
Right. Yeah.
So at some point, you realize that knowing things is not the way to become wise. And
Yeah.
the way to do that is actually to know the mind, but the mind can't really know itself. So that means instead of a knowing, it's kind of like an unknowing or an unlearning,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to go from concepts and ideas into no concepts and no ideas. And that's very much against the way that we typically are. And
Yeah.
typically, our mentation doesn't normally function that way.
Right.
So the spiritual path involves undoing
Yeah.
our normal mentation as much as we are able. And the effects of that are in many ways unspeakable, but that's the only way to actually know reality. It seems so strange, and yet that's how it is.
Mm.
But that's the thing I found, honestly. The more I looked into like what is reality, the I don't mean to use foul language here when speaking on sublime topics, but it's fucking insane and it's absurd and it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you can throw rationalization right out the fucking window.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. And you also practice a type of tantric Buddhism, I believe. And did you see any relationship between the work of Pico and Tantra?
Well, there is, in the sense that, you know, the spiritual path involves, a lot of what he's talking about in terms of,
Yeah.
you know, purification and
Right.
self-knowledge and sort of understanding the specific methods of contemplation
Mm-hmm.
and how those methods of contemplation allow us to go beyond ourself,
Right.
and that going beyond ourself is the only way to know
Mm-hmm.
the truth.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think in many ways it's totally congruent. The
Yeah.
methods are different, the view is different, but in many ways it's doing or trying to do the exact same thing.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, perhaps on that note, you could let people know where they can get a hold of a copy of Celestial Intelligences and how they can find out more about you.
Yes, absolutely. So you can get a copy of Celestial Intelligences from anathemapublishing.com, directly from their website. They have a web shop, and you can order the book. That is the fastest and easiest way to obtain it. If you want to find out about me, I think the easiest way, and I apologize, but there's just too many links to convey. The easiest way is my Linktree page. So I'm Brother Greg on Linktree. So it's linktr.ee/Brother Greg. That'll give you links to everything, books, podcasts,
Great.
and all the websites. And if anyone wants to contact me directly, my email is brothergreg@protonmail.com, and that is a good way to get in touch with me.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks very much. It's been good speaking with you.
Thank you, Angel. It's really wonderful to talk with you again. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate it very much.
You're most welcome, and congrats on the book. It's a great read, and it looks very beautiful as well.
Thank you.